Okay, let us get started. As you probably have gathered over the last week, we're taking a little break. It's a long break from Menachot, and we're getting to what seem to be very unrelated issues, of course, but I think are pretty exciting. I don't think anyone
I
minds.
love it.
Yeah,
I absolutely
exactly.
love it. I was like super excited.
It's interesting because these don't show up anywhere else. We don't have like there's a Masechet Sofrim which really talks about all these things, but there's no Gemara on it, right? It's
There's another place where that talks about mezuzot, and exactly like it seemed to me that it was like almost the same thing, but I couldn't remember where I've seen
I
it.
don't recall. I'm sure there are other places. The Gemara we have today was in Sanhedrin, we'll see, but this is the most concentrated because this is where we talk about, I mean, the Mishnayot talk about it here. So obviously that's where the Gemara takes off. So, we had a lot about mezuzah. We're about to finish mezuzah today. We're going to get onto tefillin. We're going to get onto tzitzit in the next couple of weeks. So the whole package. But today's daf, we are at the daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph. We are near the top. I'm going to start from the first word on the fourth line, Itmar. So, we've been talking about mezuzah, and one of the details about mezuzah that's complex. These Gemaras obviously are very simplified in Daf Yomi, but one of the complex issues about mezuzah is that you need a mezuzah when you live in a house, when it's a beit dira, and you need a mezuzah on the right when you go into the house. But what about a situation which is very common to us, but was not so common back then, where you had multiple people living in a house? In this case, you basically had people living downstairs and people living upstairs. And the assumption that Rashi seems to make is that each of them had a door to their house. So there's another door that gets into the house. But in addition to that main door, you open up a stairwell between the two houses. And of course, in the stairwell, as Rashi very elegantly puts it, you've got to put doors up so that people can't just come up and down into the middle of your house. So says the Gemara, not the Bright, says the Gemara at the fourth line, Itmar. Lul patuach min habayit aliyah. If you have a lul, which we translate as a stairwell, it doesn't, lul usually means like a window, but it means a connection between the first floor house and the second floor, the aliyah, the ceiling, the attic. So says Rav Huna, "Im yesh lo petach echad," if there's one doorway, right, either at the top or the bottom, right, there can be a door either way to protect them because you can have locks on either side, right? Im yesh lo petach echad, if there's one door, then chayv b'mezuzah achat, and you put your mezuzah on that door. Im yesh lo shnei petachim, if you have a door at the top and a door at the bottom, so that each homeowner can lock it or can open it, then chayav b'shnei mezuzot, then you have to have two mezuzot because each one is a way to get into a house. Says Rav Papa. Now, Rav Papa says the thing you really learn from Rav Huna, Shema Min Rav Huna, is that even though, and this is why Rashi makes the point, even though there's a different entrance to the house, but still the fact that there's a second entrance, right? So there's two basic ways out of your house, which we think is very common. They didn't have very common, right? They would have generally a small house. You walked in, you walked out. But what you see from here is high indrona, and I'm sure indrona is a word in another language, right? But it's some kind of room that has itle arba bavi. It has four doorways, four gates, like Bava Kama, right? Four doors leaving from the room. So some very big, I don't know, auditorium where you have multiple entrances. Chayav ba'arba mezuzot. You have to put a mezuzah on each door. That's an entrance into that place. And the lesson from the Aliyah is that even though you have a house and you have a second entrance that goes upstairs, you've got to put a mezuzah on both sides. Just more pshita. That seems pretty obvious, right? If you have four ways of coming in, why wouldn't you have to have a mezuzah on each one? Lo tzricha af agav diragil b'chad. No, it means even if generally, there are like emergency exits maybe, and an emergency might be different because you're not supposed to use that. But most people use one entrance. Even though there are multiple entrances, you have to put a mezuzah on each one. Rashi has a very complex discussion here because Rashi earlier, if you recall, we had a machloket about the small room of Rav and whether you needed a mezuzah. And Rashi had an unusual explanation there. So Rashi has a whole explanation that Ragil Echad means that it used to be that there were a lot of people and they would use all the doors, and now there's fewer people coming, so they only use one. They don't really use the other ones anymore, but they used to use them, and that's why you need it. But either way, the point is that if you have multiple doors that can work or do work for access, you need to put a mezuzah on each one. Now,
But that's very common nowadays that you have like
very
maybe
common.
houses with like, you have an entrance at the bottom and then you have one that goes up and that what you have a staircase that goes up, you have another apartment upstairs.
Correct. So that's a different issue. I mean, that Gemara is not addressing what your question, which is that it's common space, right? That's more the issue we had yesterday of the Beit Shar, where you have a gatehouse that goes into several homes, right? Because in our case, it's a little simpler because there's only two homeowners, right? So the doors, Basically, the door at the bottom of the stairs is the door leaving my house. The door at the top of the stairs is the door entering your house, right? So there's no, what you're mentioning is there's another question. What if there's an entry door, right? That opens up to like a common space where like you go into an apartment building, like you have in a brownstone, right? That's made into many apartments.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
go into the front, does the front door need a mezuzah? And who puts up that mezuzah, right? Because that space doesn't really belong to any of the
Okay.
individuals. So you do, right? That's a little more complicated because there it's a common space essentially. And that's more like the Beit Shar we had yesterday that opens into many houses, right? But this is simpler, right? This is just that it's a second entrance from your house to another house, basically. But I agree, it's very common nowadays. So continues the Gemara. The next case, which again, I don't have pictures, so if you have a Gemara with pictures, it might help you. But if you can imagine this, Amar Amemar, Hai Pitra da Akarna Chayv Mezuzah. If you have a doorway in the corner, it's Chayv and Mezuzah. And the point here is that you basically don't have a frame to this door, right? So one, you have two walls coming to a corner, and they end basically, I don't know, 2 feet short of the corner, and then that forms a doorway, right? But there's no official doorpost. So you still have to have a mezuzah, says Amemar. Asked Rav Ashi la Memar, Rav Ashi la Memar, like Betzimin, but there are no doorposts. Amrle, so he said, no. Adi means these are the Petzimim. These, meaning the ends of the wall, are the doorposts, because essentially that's what frames the door, right? These are the Petzimim. Now, again, the assumption here also said there might have been a door on it, but there were no doorposts officially. So those are the doorposts. Rav Papa, Ikle be Mar Shmuel. Now, Rav Papa once showed up and came to the house of Mar Shmuel, right? Mar Shmuel is, was a very senior, Rav and Shmuel, kind of early generation in Bavel. So Rav Papa came to the house of Mar Shmuel. Chazahu pitcha d'lahavile ella chad petzima mismola. There's different girsaot here, but that's the one, right? It had one patzim, one doorpost on the left side of the door, okay? I read it. The argument has patzim echad mismola. But it's the same, just different girsa. But it had one door post on the left. The hav avidale mezuzah, but Mar Shmuel had put up a mezuzah on the right side, like you're supposed to, where there was no doorpost, but there was a wall, right? So he put up a mezuzah in that place. So Amar Leser, if Papa said to Shmuel, Mar Shmuel, what do you mean, Kiman? Who are you going according to that you need to have a mezuzah in a doorway that only has one doorpost? It seems like you're going like Rabbi Meir. No, we don't know who Rabbi Meir is yet. We're going to quote the Braita of Rabbi Meir in a little bit, but trust the Gemara, obviously, that Rabbi Meir says that if you have one doorpost, you still need a mezuzah. But says Rav Papa, it's true that Rabbi Meir said that. But Eimar Damar Rabbi Meir miyamin. Rabbi Meir said that if the doorpost is on the right side when you go in, but mismo miyamar, if the doorpost is on the left, do you still need a mezuzah on the right? Meaning, do you still put up a mezuzah if the doorpost is only on the left? It says, well, before we answer the question, or I guess we don't really answer the question, but Maihi, what is this discussion of the mezuzah and whether or not it needs to be on the right side? The Tanya, because there's a Braita that actually talks about where you place the mezuzah. So the Braita says, Beitcha, right? It says, put a mezuzat beitecha, right? Taftama mezuzat beitecha. Put a mezuzah, we read this, of course, in Shema. Put a mezuzah, put this parsha al mezuzat beitecha, right? Mezuzah is confusing. Mezuzah means not the mezuzah, it means the doorpost, right? So put this parsha on the doorpost of your house. Now, house means bi'atcha, when you walk in. And it means min hayamin. It means on the right side. Says the Braita, what do you mean? Where do you see that? Ata omer min hayamin, you say it's on the right side, ein ela min hasmol. Maybe it's referring to the left side. Talmud lomar, therefore the pasuk says beitecha. It says beitecha. This is where my Talmud. How does the word beitecha, which means your house, tell you the right side? Amar Rabbah, because we read that pasuk as bi'atcha. Right, we add like an aleph, not beitecha, but bi'atcha, the way you walk in. Derech bi'atcha, which is min hayamin. You usually walk in from the right because it was a right-centric world. And chi'akar inish kare dimine akar. When you pick up your leg to start walking, assuming you're right-handed, I guess, you pick up your right leg first. So that the thrust of a person's walking starts with the right, and therefore you should put the mezuzah on the right side of the door. Okay, so that is one source. Again, we haven't got to Reb Meir yet, who talks about one patzim, but that's one source for putting the mezuzah on the right. And Rav Shmuel bar Acha kamei Rav Papa shmei Rabba Braula Amar. This is, of course, from today's Haftorah. Mehacha, the pasuk says when it describes in today's Haftorah for Shabbos Shkolim, it describes the whole story with Yehoyada Kohen taking over the collections in the Beit Hamikdash. So the pasuk says that we read this morning, "Vayikach Yehoyada kohen aron echad." Yehoyada took one aron, actually aron, like a container. Vayikach hor b'dalto, and he made a hole in the side, in the wall of it, or the lid of it. Vayitein oto eitz al mizbech miyamin bevo ish beit Hashem. He put it on the right side when you come into the Beit HaMikdash, because that's where people lean towards. You go towards the right side. Unitanu shama kohanim shomrei asaf. He put the kohanim. I'm not sure why we quote the rest of the pasuk, but he put the kohanim. Maybe it's the whole pasuk. He put the kohanim, who were the guards, and they watched al kol kesef muva Beit Hashem, all the money that came in. But the bottom line is that you see that if you want to get someone's attention, or you're focusing on what they are, you put it on the right side when they walk in, and that's why you put the mezuzah on the right side. Now, what's this Rebbe Meir, right? So we asked Mar Shmuel, you're going according to Rebbe Meir. My Rebbe Meir, where am I? We are the second to last of the narrow lines. So my Rebbe Meir, what is this Rebbe Meir that he referenced earlier? The Rav Papa said that, to Mar Shmuel, you have a mezuzah on the right side, but you only have one doorpost. Even the Rebbe Meir says you only one doorpost necessitates a mezuzah. How would he say in this case? So what is Rebbe Meir? Tanya. This is now the Braita. Again, we are the second to last narrow line. Tanya is the Braita says the following: Bayit she'ein lo ela patzim echad. Let's say you have a house that has a front door, but it only has one doorpost. Okay, I don't know if there's a better word for doorpost, but that, doorpost means you have a hole in the wall and you set up one piece of wood or metal or stone or whatever it is to protect that wall. If you only have one patzim, Rabbi Meir mechayiv mezuzah. Meir says that's an official door and it's chayiv in a mezuzah. The chachamim potrim. The Chachamim say that that's not an official door. It's a hole in the wall, basically. And it's not a door because there is no defined doorpost. And you're putter from putting a mezuzah, even if that's the way you enter the house. My time at Rabbanan. Now, what's the rationale? We're at the first wide line. What's the rationale for the Rabbanan? Because the pasuk says mezuzot ktiv. It says you should put this al mezuzot beitecha. Mezuzot is plural. So if you don't have mezuzot, then you don't have a doorway. My time at Rabbi Meir. Now, why does Rabbi Meir argue with that? Rabbi Meir says the following, the Tanya. This is a Braita of earlier Tanaim, which Rabbi Meir must go according to. What do the earlier Tanaim say? The Tanyas. The Braita says, Mizuzot. The Pasuk says, write this down and put it on Mizuzot beitecha. Shomea ani, I would read that Pasuk and say, Mi'ut Mizuzot shtayim. Okay, that's pretty reasonable. The minimum amount of mizuzot, of doorposts, that you need to have in order to be chayiv in placing a parchment with the scroll on the door is 2. But Kishu Omer mezuzot or parsha shniya, but then the Torah repeats mezuzot, right? We read 2 parshiot of mezuzah in Shema. When it repeats mezuzot in the second parsha, Shein Talmud Omar doesn't have to say mezuzot again because it already told me that. So then you get into this very unique circumstance, which is called riba achar riba, where the Torah says, do it this way, and then it says, do it this way. And our principle is, ein riboy achar riboy al lema'it. Adding something and adding it again tells you really don't even need that thing. So basically what the Torah is saying is you don't need mezuzot. Mi'ato hakatuv lemezuzah achat. The Torah is saying that you don't even need to have mezuzot. Even one mezuzah, even if you have one doorpost, you have to put a mezuzah on that doorpost. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's the opinion. In the Braita of Rabbi Yishmael, and we'll see Rabbi Meir can hold like Rabbi Yishmael that you need a mezuzah even if there's only one doorpost. Rabbi Akiva says, I agree with you, Rabbi Yishmael, but I don't agree from the source. Einut tzarich. You don't need your special limud from miyod achar miyod lema'et. I have another source for this. Kishu omer al hamashkof al shtei mezuzot. Now we have the pasuk. We had it recently in Parshat Bo. We're gonna have it in Parshat Chodesh, right? That when you take the blood from the Korban Pesach and you spread it on the mashkof, and on your meshkof, which means the over, I don't know what the name for it is, but the lintel maybe or something, whatever's on top of the door, and al shtei mezuzot, and you put it on the 2 doorposts. Now, why do you have to say shtei mezuzot? Why don't you say put it on the thing on top and al hamizuzot and on the doorposts? And I know you have 2 doorposts. How many more would you have? Says Rabbi Akiva, she'ein talmud omer shtei. Doesn't have to say the 2 doorposts because what else would you have? Why does the Torah say 2 doorposts? The zeb bana'av. In fact, it's a lesson, bana'av meaning a fundamental rule for all Torah, that kol makom shenemar mizuzot eno ela achat. That in fact, the word mizuzot, although it's plural, it only means one. It means doorposts, meaning even one. And unless the Torah says both, Ad sheyafared l'cha katuv shtayim, except by Karban Pesach, it said put it on both. But in general, says Rabbi Akiva, even though the word mezuzot is plural, it implies even one doorpost. And therefore, both Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva agree that you don't need to have two doorposts in order to be chayav in mezuzah, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir and the opinion of Mar Shmuel, who passing like Rabbi Meir. So that's the source. Continues the Gemara, a very interesting question, which is how do you know, right? So remember that if you read Shema and obviously pay attention to what it's saying, it says that you should write this down and place it on your doorpost. Well, it says you should write al mezuzot, chtaftam al mezuzot beitach. Write it on your doorposts, right? How do you know that you write it? What we do, of course, is you write it on a piece of parchment and you roll it up and you put it in a container and you put it on your doorpost. But maybe it means that you should go to your doorpost and you should chisel out the words of the mezuzah, right? Which would be a lot of work, but is not unreasonable. So it says the Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. It says uchtaftam, right? You should write this down al mezuzot beitecha. Yachol, you would think yichtevenu al avanim. Write it in the stone, right? Meaning that you get a little chisel and you write in stone, like I don't know, all the different steels that we find, right? You might think that. Says the Braita, Nemrach kan ketiva. It says by mezuzah that you write it down. The Nemar lahalan ketiva, and it says elsewhere ketiva. Now it's not clear what elsewhere is. So Rashi understands that elsewhere means by a get. It says v'katav la sefer kritut, right? You write down a get for a woman. And that ktiva is obviously on a sefer, right? You don't write it on a piece of stone. And so that's what we mean. Tosfos is very bothered by that because if you remember, we learned in Gittin that in fact you actually don't have to write a get on a sefer. You can write a get. We learned on the horn of an animal or something, So Tosfos says it means other writing, like writing for a sota, right? When you write down the words for a sota, or when you write a sefer Torah, right? All other senses of writing in the Torah. Anyways, but it says elsewhere to write things down. Ma lahalan al sefer, just like there. I mean, Rashi of course says it because it says the word sefer by a get for a woman, right? It says katav la sefer kritut. So just like there, let's say the get, according to Rashi, has to be on a sefer scroll, not on a wall, right? Avkan ala sefer. Here too, by mezuzah, it means you write it down on a piece of parchment and then you place it on the doorpost. Says the Braito, klach derech zu, or maybe you could look at it another way. Nemer kan ketiva, it says writing here, but nemer lahalan ketiva, it says, remember when they went into Eretz Yisrael, it says you should write the Sefer Torah on the stones, right? Remember the stones they put up by kataftem ala avanim. They wrote the Torah on the stones and then they covered it with seed. They covered it with plaster, right? So maybe malahalan al avanim, just like there it was on the stone directly. Afkan al avanim says the right of Bonir lemidome. Which one is more logical? Danin ketiva no heget lidorot. I would derive a ketiva that's done for all generations, meaning a mezuzah, which is done for thousands of years. Miktiva no heget lidorot, like from a get or from a sefer Torah that's done forever. You don't compare it to a ktiva that was done a one-time event, right? This was a one-time national event. You went into Eretz Yisrael, write down the words of the Torah on the stone, but that's a one-time thing. It's not a comparable, it's not a good comparison for all generations. And so therefore, it's much more logical to compare a mezuzah to say a get than to compare it to this specific time when they wrote it down on stone. And furthermore, says the Gemara, and there's a pasuk that sort of supports this. Now, it's a pasuk from Navi, but it's a pasuk that supports it. K'moshe Amar lahalan, because it says later, this is in Yirmiyahu, when Yirmiyahu was talking to Baruch ben Neriah, Vayomer lehem Baruch, right? Baruch said to them, to the people in the Beit HaMikdash, that mipiv yikarei alai et advarim ha'ela, that Yirmiyahu told me all these things. V'ani kotev ala sefer b'dio. I wrote them down on a sefer with ink. So you see that writing, again, this is a reference. Obviously, it could mean something else. But you see that stam, when you say write something, it means write it on a book, on a parchment with ink. Okay? So therefore, that's the proof that when it says write a mezuzah, it doesn't mean write it, scribe it into the wall, like encode it, dig it into the wall. It means write it on a piece of parchment. Amalei Ravacha Brei Derav Ravashi, says Ravacha to Ravashi, what do you mean? Rachmana Amar al mezuzot, right? The Torah itself says that you put it al mezuzot, right? Which means write it. It says chataftam al mezuzot. Right? So what do you mean? Torah says, write it on the doorpost. And you're saying to me, well, but it says right by a get and it says right by somewhere else. You're learning writing from somewhere else. The Torah is very clear about where to write it, right? It doesn't say write it and not say where to write it. It says where to write it. So maybe you should write it on the doorpost. Now, I think the easiest way to understand Rav is that maybe you should actually write it on the doorpost itself, right? Meaning use ink and write it down, write it on, which you could do. Says Rav Ashi answered him and said, Amar Kra, well, the pasuk says uchtaftam, which we darshaned earlier to mean ktiva tama, that first you write it completely. And then hadar al mezuzot. So it's a two-part thing. It's not write it on the doorpost. You write it, comma, and place it al ha-mezuzot. Says the Gemara, okay, well, that's fine if you darshan it that way, but then why do you need Gzeir Shava, Ktiva, Ktiva? Now that you're darshan the word uchtaftam to say you write it as one act, and then separately put it up on the doorpost, Gzeir Shava Lamli. So why do you need Gzeir Shava? Says the Gemara, because I might have thought, Ilav Gzeir Shava. If I didn't have Gzeir Shava, I wouldn't have known that you write it on parchment. Hava mina lichtova avna, that maybe you do write it, you're supposed to put it on the doorpost. What you should do is take a piece of stone, basically, and carve it out into the stone. So not write it with ink on a piece of paper, and like we do, but carve it out into, or write it on a stone even, right? Again, not lichtov can either mean carving it out, or actually writing, lichtov literally means to write it on the stone, and then likba'a asipa, and then put the stone on the doorpost, right? So kamash malan, that's why we have the chtaftam, that just like by a get for a woman, or the other examples of writing, and like case of Yirmiyahu, Baruch ben Neriah, you write it on a piece of parchment, and then affix the parchment to the doorpost. And that's how we learn out how to place the mezuzah, which of course is the way we do it. Okay, so that is now the end, sorry, for those who enjoyed it too much, of mezuzah. We move on to the next article, which is the tefillin. The Mishnah said, now we quote 4 lines from the bottom, Arba parshot shebetfilin, the 4 sections of the tefillin, ma'akvot zu'etzu, they all are necessary. Even one letter is ma'akev, and the same question we asked earlier, pshita, obviously the Torah says write it, so you got to write it. If you leave out words, it's going to be puzzle. It means even the little tiny part of the yud. We had the same answer earlier, right? And that also would make it puzzle. In fact, we need it for a different statement of Rav Yehuda. Any ktav that doesn't have empty parchment in open space around it on all 4 sides is puzzle. So you can't write right up to the edge. And that's what we mean by chtiva, that has to all be written. It can't be an open up to the edge. Okay, that's what we learned. We said the same thing by mezuzah, if you recall earlier. Turn the page to Avlam Dalad Amabet. Tanur Rabbanan says the Braita. This is a Gemara we had in Sanhedrin. We actually had in Zvachim, but it was primarily in Sanhedrin. It's how do we know that you need to have 4 sections in your tefillin, right? The Torah is very vague about what's in the tefillin. Of course, the Torah is very vague about what tefillin are, to be clear. But how do you know you need to have 4 sections in your tefillin? Says the Braita, it says tefillin 3 times. It says the word totafot, 3 times. 1 is with the vav, and 2 are without a vav. And of course, as we discussed when we learned this many times, none of them have a vav, right? So it's not really clear what the Gemara means. Maybe there's a different tradition. Maybe it's read with a vav. But either way, this is the Braita that says the totafot, 1 with the vav, 2 without. So the 2 without are singular. The 1 with the vav is plural. So 1 plus 1 plus 2 is 4. Harekan arba'a. That's how you know you need to have 4 sections, 4 parshiot in the tefillin. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Kiva says you don't need that drasha because, in fact, the way you know 4 parshiot in the tefillin is from foreign languages. Because the word totafot is, of course, a very unusual word. And the way you should read it is tat pat, right? Which is the 4 letters of the word. And tat bekitbi, in kitbi, I don't know what language kitbi is, but some foreign language, tat means 2, shtayim. And the word pat in a language called Afriki, which sounds African, but I don't know what that means either, is shtayim. So it's basically the Torah is telling you 2 and 2, and it's 4, and that's the way you know that you need to have 4 sections in your tefillin. Now, Tanur Rabbanan, before at the end of today's daf, in a few minutes probably, we're going to get to what the 4 sections are and what order they're written in. But before we get there, says the Braita, and if you were some people may know this or not, so we're going to start from the beginning. But the tefillin are written differently in the tefillin shel rosh and the tefillin shel yad. Okay, and we're going to see that in the Gemara right now. Basically, the tefillin shel rosh, I'm going to give away the ending, but we're going to get to it in the Gemara, are written in 4 separate sections. right? And in the Tefillin Shel Rosh, there actually are boxes that are separate between each of the four parshiot. And the Tefillin Shel Yad are written in one big section, and it's all put together. Okay, now how do we know all of that? So it's Tanur Rabbanan. Says the Bright. No, actually, it's all Halacha Moshe Sinai, but there's some not. It's not all. It's mostly Halacha Moshe Sinai. There's some references in the pasuk. So Tanur Rabbanan. Let's learn how we know all that. We're on the third line of Lamed Dalet Amud Bet. Yachol Yichtavei Arba Orot. Now we're talking here about the Tefillin Shel Rosh. Okay, and you might think that you should write them on four separate pieces of parchment, v'yinichim ba'arba batim, and place them in four different houses, meaning these are leather houses, right? Ba'arba orot, using four different pieces of skin. So obviously we're using leather for everything. Some are outside containers, some are what you write on. So you might think keep them all separate. Talmud Omer, therefore the pasuk says, Lizikaron beinenach. It should be a memory, but it's a single language. Zikaron echad amarti lecha. It should be one memory between your eyes. Velo shnayim u'shlosha zichronot. It can't be like you have four different things or two to three different things on your head. Haketz. So what do? Kotvan al arba orot. You actually write them on four different pieces of parchment, so four parshiot. Minichan barba batim. You put each one in its own house inside the tefillin, but you combine all of those houses bar echad. You have basically one piece of skin, one piece of leather on top of all of them. So you have four individual compartments on the inside and one compartment essentially on the outside. Continues the Braita, but if you're katvan ba'arachan, if you actually write them in one script, so you take one piece of parchment and you write all four of them, but then there's different ways to do this, but you could basically make small incisions in between them and then put them down into the four boxes, v'nichan ba'arba batim, so they're still connected, but they're in four separate containers inside the tefillin. That would be yatsa. Then you would be yotze, but but there has to be a clear space between one parsha and the next parsha. Divrei Rebbe. So that's what Rebbe says, that you're supposed to ideally have four parshiot in four batim, but if it's one piece of leather, one piece, sorry, of parchment, and as long as it's placed in four batim and there's a space between each one, you're yotze. That's what Rebbe says. And the Chachamim say, Einot tzarich, you don't even need the space between them. You can put them right next to each other. But everybody agrees, Shavim, even the Chachamim who say you don't need a space between them, Shenotein chut o meshicha ben kol achat v'achat. There has to be some separation between each of the four parshiot. A chut means a string, a meshicha, I don't know how we translate, same idea, right? We translate as a rubber band nowadays, right? But something like that has to be between each one, meaning that there has to be a clear separation inside the tefillin between one and the other. How do they translate meshicha?
String or cord.
Cord. Okay, yeah, same as something you tie with. And if the charitz means a furrow, like an indentation, if you can't tell, most understand this means, I mean, all of us pretty much understand, it means from the outside. If you can't see on the outside that there's separate compartments, so if you look at tefillin, I don't have any in front of me, you'll see on the tefillin shel rosh that there's clearly lines, there are three lines and going down it, so that there's four compartments where the four parshiot are on the inside. So that is the tefillin shel rosh. Continues the Braita. What about the tefillin shel yad? Tanur Rabbanan. Now there's another Braita that talks about a tefillin shel yad, and this Braita says, where am I? Somewhere. I don't know, I guess around 10 lines from the top. Tanur Rabbanan, Ketzad Kotvan, how do you write, these are the tefillin shel yad, how do you write the tefillin shel yad? Says the Braita, tefillah shel yad, kotval or echad. The four parshiot of the tefillin shel yad, it's still four parshiot, but you write them all on one piece of parchment. Continues the Braita, v'im katva ba'arba orot, but if you wrote them on four separate parchments, but you put them inside one container, then you're yatsa. Because the point here is that unlike tefillin shel rosh, which are four separate containers, there has to be one container for the tefillin shel yad. However, says the Braita, tzarich ledabek. You have to attach them to each other. So you can write them on four separate pieces if you need to, but you have to attach, as Rashi says, with glue or with tying them. You have to make sure that they are connected. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, it has to be a sign on your hand. And the way we understand that is that not only, says Rashi explains this beautifully, that not only is someone looking at you from the outside as to say, oh, there's one box on your hand, but you have to be able to feel it on the inside. And this, of course, gives us an important opportunity to understand that the tefillin that they had were very different than ours, right? Our tefillin are like plastic, right? They're rock hard. And so someone wearing tefillin does not feel the parchment inside the tefillin. But if you imagine tefillin as like a very thin coat of leather, which is probably what it was when they had, less quality tannery and they didn't have high pressure and all the things we do, you would basically, it was a very flimsy thing and you could feel the parshiot through the tefillin. So if there were four of them bouncing around, you would feel that on your arm as opposed to one. And that's how Rashi explains it. That's what he doesn't use the word bouncing, but that's how Rashi explains it, right? That kishem she'ot achat mi b'chutz, just like on the outside it's one container. Kach ot achat mi b'fnim, so too on your arm you have to feel it like one thing together. And if the four are separate, you will feel that. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't even need to tie them together. Einot tzarich, as long as they're all together in one container, the fact that they're not tied together is okay. It says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda actually admits to me. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated, because as we just said, the Tefillin Shel Rosh have four compartments of four parshiot, and you have to be able to tell from the outside that there's four compartments. The Tefillin Shel Yad is the opposite. It's four parshiot in either one scroll or four scrolls that are tied together, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yossi says, well, they have to be together in one container, but they don't have to be tied together. Says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Berebi admits to me that if you, let's say you don't have tefillin shel yad, you go, you show up in shul, you show up wherever in your trip, and you have two tefillin shel rosh. So the problem is you could rearrange the strings and tie them on your hand, but they're different, right? Because a tefillin shel rosh is four compartments of tefillin. So says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Berebi admits to me, Shem ein lo tefillin shel yad, if you don't have a tefillah for the hand, v'yesh lo shtei tefillin shel rosh, so what can you do? All you need to do is take a piece of leather and cover the tefillin shel rosh. So now it looks like one container. Shetoleh or alachat mehen umenicha. You take a piece of leather, a piece of skin, hide, and you put it on top of one of the tefillin shel rosh, and that one becomes tefillin shel yad. Because now all of a sudden it made it one container. Now, the problem, of course, is that on the inside, it's still four different containers because it's tefillin shel rosh. So it says, what do you mean he admits to you? That's where Rabbi Yehuda argued with you, right? Moda, hainu plutayu. He doesn't admit to you. This is what he said, that it's not kosher if there are four separate containers on the inside. Amar Rava says, Rava, what Rabbi Yossi is trying to tell you gently is that Rabbi Yehuda changed his mind. Midavarav shel Rabbi Yossi, you can understand that Chazarba, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda actually accepted Rabbi Yossi's teaching, at least according to Rabbi Yossi. We got to hear it from Rabbi Yehuda, but that's Rabbi Yossi's version, is that Rabbi Yehuda admits to him that all you need to do to turn tefillin shel rosh into tefillin shel yad is to cover it over with one big piece of leather, which basically means you make it into one container. Once it's one container, it's true. Ideally, the four parshiot should be written in one parchment, but if they're not, it's still kosher. And he would admit that. So, is that really true that you can convert tefillin shel rosh into tefillin shel yad? Eini v'shalach Rav Chananya mishmei Rabbi Yochanan. We got a message from Rabbi Chananya in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that tefillah shel yad, if you have a tefillin shel yad osinato shel rosh, you can re-sew that basically, make it to shel rosh, which would be complicated, right? You'd have to make boxes on the inside, you'd have to re-sew it, but that's okay. You can do that. But shel rosh einoto shel yad. You can never turn tefillin shel rosh into shel yad. And why not? You're not allowed to. The tefillin shel rosh have a higher kedusha than the tefillin shel yad. Rashi has a couple explanations for why, but the simpler one he says is that we always have in the tefillin the name of Hashem, Shin Daled Yod Shakai, right? And the Shin and the Daled are in the tefillah shel rosh, and the Yod is in the tefillah shel yad. So there's more of the Hashem's name on the rosh than there is in the hand. That's one of Rashi's pshatim. So you're not allowed to go down from the kedusha chamura of tefillin shel rosh into kedusha kala of tefillin shel yad. Says well, Lokasha, you're right, but that's not a problem because it's true that you're not supposed to do that, but that's referring to ba'atikta, tefillin that are old, meaning they've been used already. And so once you use it for tefillin shel rosh, you can't turn it to tefillin shel yad. But if it's bechadita, if it's a new one, and you made it for tefillin shel rosh, and someone walks into the store and says, "I really need tefillin shel yad," the sofer can change it. You'd have to add a parchment, not a leather on top to make it one container, and you could turn it into tefillin shel yad. Says more, well, even if you say you've never used it, but you clearly made it for tefillin shel rosh, right? That's what it looks like. Laman damar hazmana milti. Remember, we had a big machloket elsewhere. It's in Hedron and elsewhere about whether when you designate something for a mitzvah, it is considered to be designated for that mitzvah. So if you hold that hazmana, that preparing something is a milta, meaning it counts, then the fact that you made it for Shel Rosh, even if you never used it, should mean that you're not allowed to change its Kedusha. So if you hold that, you have to understand it's a case where the Atni Alayo Meikar, when you made a Tnai, you made a condition when you originally made the tefillin, which would not be uncommon, right? Because a sofer never knows who's going to walk into his shop. So you made a tefillin shel rosh, but you said to yourself, if someone comes in and they want to use this for shel yad, I make it tonight that I can turn it into shel yad. And that's where Reb Yossi earlier said that Reb Yehuda would admit to him that you're allowed to do that because even though the parshiyot on the inside are going to be separate, the fact that you put one big piece of leather on top, you made it to one section, that is good enough in a pinch, maybe, to make it a tefillah shel yad. Okay, says the Gemara now, this is one of the most famous machlokus in all of everything, let's say that. And this is, what is the order of the tefillin? Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita, 4 lines, 6 lines
I
from the
sent a
bottom.
picture actually from the art scroll about the different versions. I sent it to the group.
Okay, perfect. So Tanu Rabbanan, that would be great. Tanu Rabbanan, I'll speak it out a little bit. What is the order? So remember, there are 4 parshiot in tefillin, Ketzat Sidron. So says the Braita, the order of the parshiot is the following. Kadeshli, which again, these are, remember, the first 2 parshiot of tefillin are in Bo, right? And then we have the 2 in Shema. So Kadeshli kol bechor, which is 1, V'hayaki yiviacha, which is the second parsha in Shemot, right? Those 2, so again, there are 4 spots. I'm going to call it A, B, C, and D. Let me call it that. So Kadesh Li goes in the first spot on the right. Hayaki V'yacha goes in the second spot to its left, and that's Miyamin from the right side. Shema V'hayam Shema Bismo. The parsha of Shema goes in. This is Rashi's pshat, just to be clear, and how our tefillin, if you use Rashi tefillin, are. Shema is in the third spot, and V'hayam Shema is in the fourth spot. So you go, straight in the order that they are in the Torah, because the first 2 parashot in Bo, and then the last 2 are in Devarim. Before I tell you how Rabbeinu Tam argues with that, the very famous Rabbeinu Tam, right? Let's finish the Gemara first. It says in Gemara Vatanya Ibcha, but the Brayta says the opposite, that you do the opposite order, that you go instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, you go 4, 2, 3, 1. Amar Abaye Lokasha, well, obviously it depends on your perspective, right? It's a mirror image. Kami minosho kore, someone who's reading, so if I'm wearing tefillin and you, the audience, are facing me, you're the reader, so then for you, it should be from right to left, because you read Hebrew right to left. So on the right side should be the first parsha, then should be second, third, and fourth. But if I'm wearing them, obviously on my right is number 4, 3, 2, and 1. Kami minosho miniach. But hakore, the person who's looking at you and reading it, kore kisidram, you read them in the order that they appear in the Torah, with the parsha and Bo first, and then the parsha, of course, of Bo, Dvarim, and or Vet Chanan and Akev. So that is Rashi's pshat. And I don't know if Miriam showed a picture or not, but that's how we have it. Rabbeinu Tam says that doesn't make any sense. Because why in the world wouldn't we just say, put them to 4 in order, right? Why does it say 2 on the right in that order and 2 on the left in that order? So the way Rabbeinu Tam understands this is that you do the parsha of Vahaya, where am I? Vahaya, Kadeshli is in the first spot. We're going to call it spot number A. Hayaki Yivyacha is spot number B. So from the right side, you go 1 and 2. But then you switch to the left side. So you go to the outside, which in my A, B, C, D is D. And in D, which is the leftmost side, is where you would put Shema. And then in C, you would put Vayam Shema. So basically, he switches around the last 2 parshiot. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, he goes 1, 2, 4, 3, basically. And as the Gemara says in 1 second, Amar Rav Chanano, Amar Rav, Hichlif Parshiotav Psulot. If you switch the order, they're puzzle. So obviously, if you go with Rabbeinu Tam, they're puzzle, according to Rashi. If you go with Rashi, they're puzzle, according to Rabbeinu Tam. So it's not like there's options here, right? You can't do both. And that's why, of course, some people do tefillin of both. It might be a little depressing to hear that these are not the only 2 opinions, right? So you could have other orders, and therefore,
Yeah, here it shows 4 orders.
right. So you could have many, and the problem is that one is not kosher for the other. So you've got to sort of make up your mind and decide. But says the Gemara, let's just read the last bits for today. We're 2 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav Chanana, Amar Rav, Hichlif Parshiotav. If you switch the order of the sections, Sulot. Okay? Amar Abaye, says Abaye, when they say you switch them, and again, I'm going to use the terminology which to me makes sense in my head. I apologize if you're not an abstract thought, a mind reader like me, but A, B, C, and D, meaning A is the rightmost facing the person, B and C are the middle, and D is the leftmost. So says Abaya, well, the only problem if you switch them is if you switch the inner ones with the outer ones, right? So A and D are the outside and B and C are the inside. So if you switch Parsha A with Parsha B, then that's a problem. So says Abaya, Lo Amran, Ella, top of Lamed Hey and Aleph, Ella Gviata Lebriata. If you put the outside Parshiot, which again would mean either A or D in my example, with the middle ones, right? Avol Gviata Legviata. If you switch the outside one for the other outside one, so you take the rightmost one, which according to Rashi is Kadeshli, and you take the leftmost one, which is Vahayam Shemoa, and you switch those, that's not a problem. And the same thing is true about the middle ones. Briata Briata, let them. If you switch the middle one for the middle one, there's not a problem. Says Rava, I don't understand your logic whatsoever, right? Amalei Rava, why in the world would it matter if you switch some and not switch the others? Who cares? Says Rava, Maishna Gviata the Briata, Briata the Gviata de lo. Why is it that you said you can't switch the outside ones for the inside ones? Why? Because it's supposed to be on the outside, and instead you're putting it on the inside. The Haboy, the Mirsi Avira, outside one is supposed to be on the perimeter. It's supposed to see the air, and it lokachazian. It doesn't. Had the lo kabay the or the one that's in the middle that you then put on the outside, kachazia. Now it sees the air on the outside. But still, says Rava, by that logic, any switching should be a problem. Briata the briata, gviata the gviata nami. If you switch one middle one for another middle one, so position 2 with position 3 or B and C, right? You switch those, or A and D, then it's still you put it in the wrong position. A is supposed to be on the right side, is now on the left side. Small, and the one on the left side, small. So if you really think that the order matters, then I don't really think you can say there's any difference between which ones you switch. Ella lo shna, there is no difference between which ones you switch, and the halacha is that any switch in the order makes the tefillin puzzle. And that's how we pass according to Rava. So basically, you have to do exactly what the Gemara said. And unfortunately, there's a machlok about what the Gemara said, right? So according to Rashi, which again is the I think most people have their tefillin that way. It's exactly the order that's written in the Torah. 1, 2, 3, 4 in order, and Rabbeinu Tam switches around the last two. So Rabbeinu Tam would have a 1, 2, 4, 3, and like Miriam pointed out, there are other opinions because remember our Gemara said it depends on which perspective, but there's different ways to look at the perspective. It could be mirror image of that perspective, right? It could be the opposite. So hopefully you have your tefillin the right way according to your halacha.
I don't have to worry about that.
Parents not worrying about that. So tomorrow, God willing, we'll pick up 7:45 a.m. With some more details about the halachot of tefillin. I hope everyone can join us.
Thank you.
Shavua tov.
Shavua tov.
Thank you. Shavua tov. Good night.
Night.